more mankind probes into the mysteries of life, the more urgent becomes the quest for his origins. Did all life gradually evolve from some single-celled creature? Can the slow processes of time and chance create new species? Or do the facts of science fit better with the idea that a master designer created the various basic kinds of animals and designed them to reproduce after their own kinds, but with a built-in genetic potential for wide variation through selective breeding within each kind? Should the history of living things be represented by a single evolutionary tree which indicates a single common ancestor of all life, or by a forest of trees, each representative of different original kinds, and each with the potential for great variation? In the English county of Kent lies the sleepy village of Down. If a famous man had never lived here, you and I would probably never have heard of it, and the village could have slept on beside its green pastures and old trees. But here it is, the mansion of Charles Darwin. Today it is a museum dedicated to him and his work. In this study, he wrote the books that brought a new belief to the world, a belief in progress, in the development from primitive to ever higher stages until, perhaps, it will achieve perfection, a belief that sometimes sounds curiously like a new religion. It's called evolution.
I have here a first edition copy of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, published in 1859. The book caused an enormous stir in all parts of the world when it came out. Now, who was Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was an English gentleman. He was brought up and studied for about 2 years medicine in Edinburgh. And then he went to Cambridge and studied for Holy Orders and graduated MA there. Now, what does his book say, and why did it cause the huge stir that it did cause? Well, Darwin sets out to prove that life, plants and animals, undergoes small variations which are coupled or caused by the environment, and that these small changes in human biology and in animal and plant biology are inherited. That is, to put it crudely, if a giraffe stretches its neck, and stretches its neck to reach the topmost leaves of a tree, then in the course of generations, if all the generations stretch their neck to reach the tops of the tree, then the neck of the giraffe will get longer and longer and longer until we have a giraffe. If I might put it a little bit more near home, if the blacksmith uses his biceps muscles to hit his hot iron in the smithy, in the course of time he will get large biceps. Darwin thought that those changes are inheritable. Therefore, wherever you have life, you will get life fitting into the environment, and that fitting into the environment will cause life to develop upwards right up to man. Now, when Darwin was a young man, he didn't go into holy orders. He was offered the job of naturalist on this ship. We have now a nice little model there of the Beagle, on which he went round the world in 5 years to do his job as a naturalist. And there he found lots of evidence on which he thought he could base his theories.
In December 1831, the Beagle leaves the harbor at Plymouth. After a voyage along the coast of Brazil and other parts of South America, the ship reaches the Galapagos Islands. During this trip, Darwin studies the geology of the landscape. Everything is carefully written down each day in this diary. At Galapagos, he makes an interesting discovery. He finds some different finches, which no doubt originally belonged to one species. But on these several separate islands, they apparently had developed into different species. These variations within a kind gave him some new and exciting thoughts. If it were possible for one species of finch to develop different characteristics, then why couldn't that development go on even further?
Now, he extended that idea not only to remain within a species or within a kind such as the finches represent, but he thought that you could go into what the French are happy to call transformism, that is, that one species could change over into another higher species, so that in the end you could go from an amoeba to a man by this basis, on this basis of small variations which are inheritable and passed on, so that you get evolution gradually over very many years, large numbers of years, from the simplest forms of life up to the highest form of life, which we human beings claim ourselves to be. Now, if you listen to the broadcasts on these things and read the books on this subject, you will find that people maintain that on the basis of Darwin's ideas, as represented today by Neo-Darwinism, wherever life arrives, wherever energy and matter is, that energy and matter will form life, and that matter, once it's formed life, will evolve itself up automatically to the highest forms of conscious life, and that will have to happen on the basis of Darwin's theories.
By the time Darwin dies in 1882 and is buried in Westminster Abbey, his idea of evolution has spread all over the world. In another part of Europe, in Brno, in today's Czechoslovakia, we find another clergyman interested in biology. Since 1856, a monk in an Augustine monastery had been conducting some strange experiments. His name, Gregor Mendel.
Gregory Mendel, although he was a monk, was the first man to set the science of heredity on a sound mathematical basis. As is well known, he worked on garden peas, the dwarfs and the various colors, and showed that the distribution of the strains, the variations in the strains, corresponded to perfectly well-defined mathematical laws. If his work had not been forgotten for practically 50 years until the turn of the century, it was published, of course, in an obscure scientific journal, and nobody noticed it. If his work on the mathematics of heredity had been known, it would have saved an enormous amount of speculation which occurred later on the origin of species.
The monastery in Mendel's time stood on Austrian territory, and Brno was then called Brunn. Here, on a small piece of land, he bred his garden peas. 9 years later, in 1865, Mendel triumphantly told about his exciting new discovery. He was absolutely sure, on the basis of his experiments with the peas, that you can mathematically predict how different qualities will be inherited by succeeding generations. Hereditary qualities don't disappear, not even in crossbreeding with different variations. They will come forth again and again, and it is possible to predict when and even how. The scientific society was not impressed at the time, and so Mendel died in 1884 without much recognition. Now, what exactly are the famous hereditary laws of Mendel? Take a red flower and a yellow one. They fall in love, get married, and have children. 4 beautiful red flowers. These 4, in due time, also have children. 3 nice red ones. But look, 1 yellow flower. Perfect red parents and a yellow child. How is that possible? Let's look at the genes to find the solution. Each one of the red and yellow grandparents has 2 genes of the same color. Their children inherit 1 gene from each parent, and so they have a red one and a yellow one. But because red is dominant, their color is red. The story goes on. They also have children, and again, 1 gene of each parent is inherited. So then you have completely red couples, mixed couples, and completely yellow pairs of genes, and a pure yellow flower. Looking at the flowers, we see true beauty. Incredible colors and shapes form a pattern so wondrous that one cannot help feeling a deep admiration for the creative power and intelligence of the one who decided on the 3rd day of creation that this was to be. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding the seed after its kind, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And God saw that it was good. Now, what exactly is a kind?
In life, we meet with various kinds or species. So we shall turn to this question of what a species is, which can be quite difficult. The experts call a species an interbreeding pool of genes. What they mean by this is that each kind or species has a blueprint for its basic type. There is the dog kind, which has a particular type of blueprint. There's the coyote belongs to that, there's the wolf, there's the St. Bernard, there's the Pekingese, there's the Dachshund, and all the various kinds of dogs that you get. Now, they're different from one another, but they will breed with one another, and therefore they belong to the same kind or interbreeding pool of genes. If the physical differences are not too big, you can get a St. Bernard to breed with a Pekingese. Now, the cat kind is similar. It has a basic form of DNA blueprint, which is so similar that the various types of cat will, under circumstances, breed with one another because the DNA molecules do fit to one another. Now, if that's the case, you have then a species. As you see, it's a rather difficult term to define. The important point to remember is this, that it's exceedingly difficult to get one kind to breed with another. You can't get cats to breed with dogs because the DNA molecules don't have the basic fit to one another to enable breeding to take place.
But sometimes something happens in the DNA molecules and chromosomes. An alteration takes place, one which we call a mutation, In 1886, a Dutchman with the name of Hugo de Vries discovers something exciting while collecting wildflowers. He knows the ordinary Anatheria, but here he finds unknown types of the same family. Taking them home and breeding them, he gets completely new types and publishes his results in 1901 and 1903 under the title Die Mutationstheorie. During these same years, the results of Mendel's work drew public attention, but seemed to make Darwin's theory of gradual evolution impossible. Mutations now suddenly became the new magic wand in neo-Darwinism, by which the solid barriers between the different species could be overcome. Now, why does a mutation occur? One of the answers is radiation. Here, for instance, using X-rays, new types of African violets are bred by deliberate mutation. These mutations, prompted by radiation and other causes, can occur both in plants and in animals. But what does a mutation really do, even when they look as pretty as these? Do they really improve the kind or the species? The answer is no. Let's look at one example, the fruit fly. The Dutch genetic biologist, Dr. Willem Oerniel, explains.
Now, what do all these mutants mean? The important question for evolutionists has always been whether it could be shown whether mutations play any role in the supposed evolution. Because the only two mechanisms that are supposedly known for the alleged evolution are mutations and, secondly, natural selection, a process in nature by which these mutations are selected. And favored mutations are heaped up so that we gradually get all kinds of different animals. Now, what is true of this by the solid facts of genetics? Now, the first fact is that we can maintain these nice mutations in the laboratory quite well because we protect them, we are very nice to them and we look after them. But these poor animals would easily die in nature because all these mutations damage them. They are very damaging, harmful to their viability, and often they are simply directly lethal. So mutations are harmful. They are very interesting to us. They are very useful to us because by these mutations we can study a lot of the genetic laws in animals, but they are very unuseful and very harmful to the animals.
Mutations in nature actually damage and weaken the species. In our day of atomic bombs and nuclear plants, we are understandably afraid of radiation and the bizarre malforming mutations that can be its result. But can natural selection help by favoring small positive mutations and helping them to develop into new and stronger species?
Now, what does natural selection really do? Let's take some examples. Say you have an organism which undergoes a certain number of mutations, and 95% of these mutations are negative. That is, they're a hindrance to the organism. Natural selection will certainly cut out those organisms in the course of time which are less suited to their environment. If a man gets diabetes by losing some information in his genes, even by mutation, then he will be less able to compete with other people who are healthy. And the same applies right throughout the animal kingdom. So it certainly does prevent the strain or the species or the kind from deteriorating. It destabilizes from going downhill. Now, let's look at the other side. Say you do get an organism which has a mutation 1%, 2% above the average, so that it has an advantage. Now, if an organism has some sort of an advantage. Say it starts to develop an eye. Say a worm starts to develop an eye. That is, an earthworm doesn't have an eye, of course, it just has a black spot. But if that worm starts to develop, say, a retina and all these sorts of things, then that half-finished new organism, which is coming out from a positive mutation, will be, until it's perfect, a hindrance. So natural selection and mutation, what they will do together is prevent the drift downwards of a species. But they will certainly never take care that a species starts to drift upwards, because the natural selection will take care that better earthworms, say, are produced, but not earthworms that are half other animals, say half snakes or half amphibians or anything like that, because they would have a disadvantage according to Darwin's own theory.
Darwin thought natural selection, the struggle for life and the survival of the fittest, would cause a slow but irresistible evolution from one species into the other. From dead matter to primitive forms of life. From primitive forms of life to complicated ones. From algae and amoebas all the way up to primates and man. But Darwin was definitely wrong. Natural selection itself prevents this.
The whole theory is dependent upon the idea that you won't get, by chance, a complete new organ produced at once, a macro mutation. But you will get small changes. Now, those small changes, up to something better, will be a disadvantage to the species until they are complete. And as they never are complete, your natural selection prevents the drift upwards just as effectively as it prevents the drift downwards. And that being the case, we can account for the fact that species, humans, animals and plants, have remained constant through all these years by this feedback mechanism which Darwin rightly produced. What he didn't say is that it would prevent a drift, a slow drift upwards, just as effectively as it will prevent a slow drift downwards.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after its kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after its kind.
When the Bible says that God made the animals and man and the plants after their kind, to breed after their kind, we've come up against an absolutely basic scientific truth, which is today just as true as when Moses wrote it down. So God did make the interbreeding pools of genes constant. You can vary within them, but you can't go outside the frontiers of that pool of interbreeding genes. You can vary within it, but not without it. Just like a piece of music from Mozart, by point mutations, point changes, can't be changed into a Bach fugue or can't be changed into a sonata of Mozart. They remain constant. And this is just what the Bible says about the species and kinds which God made. The laws which we found out stabilize them within their own frontiers perfectly rigidly.
So we see that the laws and discoveries of genetics provide strong support for creation. It is also important to note that the fossils agree with these findings. In fact, Darwin called the fossil evidence perhaps the most serious objection to the theory of evolution. Dr. Gary Parker is one of a number of former ardent evolutionists who have changed their minds and become convinced creationists after deeper study of these matters.
In most people's minds, fossils and evolution go hand in hand. In reality, fossils are a great embarrassment to evolutionary theory and offer strong support for the concept of creation. If evolution were true, we should find literally millions of fossils that show how one kind of life slowly and gradually changed into another kind of life. But missing links are the trade secret, in a sense, of paleontology. The point is, the links are still missing. What we really do find are gaps that sharpen up the boundaries between kind. It's those gaps that provide us with the evidence of creation of separate kinds. As a matter of fact, there are gaps between each of the major kinds of plants and animals. Transition forms are missing in their millions. What we do find are separate and complex kinds pointing to creation.
At the end of his life, Darwin was still full of doubts and frustrated by his own theories, still wondering about the big questions of life. And so he died, finally to meet his creator, the one who said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after its kind. And God saw that it was good.